our next guests are the authors of Event Horizon, just got my copy, Sexuality, Politics, Online Culture, and the Limits of Capitalism, Bonni Rambatan and Jacob Johanssen. So much in this book, and it's not even that big. First off, for a dummy like me, thank you. All right, so I'm just gonna go around. Feel free to talk over yourself. Sometimes it's hard over Zoom and different doing things virtually. I guess my big question is, how did you imagine putting all these ideas together? Because you cover a lot here, and it's sort of a lead up, like how the memes, for instance, the cuteness of the internet. Is this really just, I guess, a pipeline, like how the pipeline works on the internet into radicalization and anti-capitalism?
Jacob, do you want to take that?
I think how we sort of got sort of into writing this book, and I think you're right. So the book is kind of, it's bringing lots of kind of stuff together. It's also kind of maybe bringing things together that might not appear to be, necessarily sort of connected, but we really also kind of wanted to join the dots, with this book, sort of taking the internet, as it currently is. We can probably all agree on that we are in a very sort of, messy internet, or that the internet is a bit of a mess. And we wanted to kind of take that, as a starting point to kind of think about how did we get to this, we think very, very bad internet. How can we make sense of that? How can we actually, kind of analyze the internet with a view towards, kind of maybe alternatives, or, what the left can do, and also how is the left a little bit part of the problem at times as well, that we're sort of seeing, unfolding on social media and things like that, with various kind of things like harassment and so on. And for us, how to kind of approach this mess, how to untangle this mess. One way of doing that for us was through psychoanalysis, and we probably will talk about that more, as we go along. But that as a sort of way in to things, yeah.
Bonni, how did you get started on this? I mean, what point did you start to realize something was occurring that was a little bit more nefarious than, say, just your everyday cute meme?
Well, I've dabbled in like online cultural studies and cyber cultural studies for a while. In fact, that was how Jacob and I got to know each other. So I've always been interested in like how, especially because I learned psychoanalysis and stuff like that, and it's all about linguistics, right? And I have a feeling that there's this whole online culture. It's all about the symbols and the language and the communication networks and how that evolves, right? So the way that I see this is that obviously nothing is separate from the dynamics of that we can analyze in psychoanalysis, right? So that's why when we think of like selfies and cuteness and stuff like that, then there's always something there. There's always something beneath the surface that's going on, right? So that was how that we actually got to writing this book. And there isn't exactly a point that I kind of suspected that there's something wrong. But it's just that when I've learned about online culture from the beginning, there's always this sense of jouissance in Lacanian terms, right? There's this whole for example, self-righteousness from both the left and the right in the meme cultures and stuff like that. So that was how we kind of set about doing this book.
And then also, sorry,
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Maybe kind of as a probably as a sort of key moment that kind of was probably played sort of huge part in turning the internet and social media in particular right wing, was sort of 2015, 2016, Trump meme wars and kind of Gamergate, harassment campaigns and, all that sort of stuff has left such a lasting kind of impression, has left such a bitter taste, and has shaped online culture to such a degree. If we were to pinpoint, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint the sort of starting point, but I think that would be one, where we would kind of say, okay, what happened there, and how can we sort of understand, the role of memes now, the role of kind of online politics, and how it's also kind of all related to sex, right? In psychoanalysis, it's a bit of a cliche, everything is about sex, but we kind of sort of unpack that in the book as well. In a way that's true, and it's particularly true when it comes to the internet today.
So, okay, we touch on these things a lot on the show. So I'm like almost like, where do we start? How do we dig into this? Because it is such a big topic. But let's just start with Gamergate. I think that's a good starting point for a lot of folks. First off, can you remind people who may not have been aware, weren't gamers, weren't involved in it, what Gamergate was?
So Gamergate essentially sort of was a harassment campaign that started out, or has its sort of origins on 4chan and on Reddit, so kind of quite notorious communities in themselves, or kind of platforms in themselves. At least certain parts of 4chan, certain parts of Reddit, quite notorious for racism, fascism, misogyny, all sorts of kind of abusive behavior and so on. And Gamergate sort of came about because a man who used to be a boyfriend of a video game critic, and then that relationship kind of broke down. He wrote a very kind of abusive sort of document about that person, and that was published online, and then it was sort of circulated all over the place, and gamers, the gaming community, at least that part of it, men, sort of took that on and sort of developed that into a harassment campaign of specifically video game designers, video game journalists, many of whom identifying as women, many of whom also people of color or queer people and so on, because they felt that the traditional sort of white male domain of video games is being now undermined, their turf sort of being invaded, and then this led to kind of harassment campaigns, of lots of people on Twitter, for example, and kind of sort of getting ridiculous sort of memes and hashtags trending on Twitter and stuff like that, while they were always sort of pretending that this was about kind of having a conversation about sort of video games journalism and ethics and stuff like that, which it never was. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of simplifying here a little bit, but that was Gamergate, and it really left a kind of it left a sort of lasting impression, I think, on the internet, on online culture and social media in particular.
Well, I think what's interesting about this, Bonni, is you can see this pattern, whether you're looking on the right or I'm a woman on the internet. I face this a lot. I know my colleagues, we've been in memes. Anybody who challenges, I'll just throw out an example. I've been one of the folks for a couple of years now challenging Joe Rogan. And every time I do that, it's like, goes back to, well, it's just, we should have free speech. Just exactly what you said. This is about fairness and he should have a platform and you're for censorship and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, it's not actually, he's being rewarded with a platform. But then suddenly the memes come out and all of the other female hosts, which there aren't many in the political space, get put into memes, like we're the mean girls or whatever. And I don't know who these people. I don't know if some of them are real that are putting this out there. There might be a few that are real, and there might be a lot that are bots or paid to do this. Is this sort of like a business model now to protect certain folks on the right and to quiet and silence, dissenting voices? I'll start with, women in this case. Is there a sense of that, Bonni?
Yeah, not deliberately as a business model, but obviously when we talk about capitalism, then of course it really benefits on how to exploit these kinds of antagonisms, right? Mm-hmm. The business model in and of itself is seemingly innocuous, right? It's just like, it's very innocent. It's just, they just want engagement. They just want like the largest share of the market, and just follow where the market is and what the market wants and how it behaves. But the market behaves in ways that are perpetuating and sharpening these kinds of antagonisms, and that's why things go south in many ways, right? So we talk about the reification of and the valorization of antagonism in this book, right? And that's, I mean, the more you discourse online, the more the platforms are winning, the more the platforms are benefiting. And a lot of the time we don't exactly realize that. We feel all like a lot of us, both the left and the right, but mostly the left, right? Because the right tend to troll a lot more, but the left tend to want to explain and just discourse and just these things. But then it's just the sense of heroism after you win a flame war. That's where does that lead, and what kind of benefits, what kind of changes does that go? And what we want to analyze here is that what are the kinds of desires that are at play here, right? And where do they come from? Who designed these things, right? And how much do these algorithms in the platforms affect our own desires and our own sense of fighting for liberation? But is it really,
Right.
is it like, how do we make sense of all of this, and how do we become critical in our own fights, in our own discourses, in our own conduct online?
So let's touch on some of the sexuality stuff. I know we're jumping all over, but there's a lot. Well, actually, before we get to that, because there's the narcissism and the gamification aspect, and I think that's a good dovetail into the sexuality, because I mean there's no doubt, right? So if you're a woman, let's say, or you identify as a woman, and you're on the apps and you're on the internet, what kind of content are you likely to see versus a traditional, their target audience, the white male?
Definitely, and also, a lot of things, especially for me personally, the sharpest difference, the most palpable difference, is when I accidentally log out of social media, and it just then the app has no information except where I, and it's just that they just assume. They just feed content to my feed, push content to my feed based on what people in Jakarta, for example, usually consume. And then a lot of it, sadly, it gets worse if I go back to my hometown, which is like a smaller city from this one. And then a lot of it just becomes all of these conspiratorial thinking, and just all of these fake news and all of these things, right? Yeah, but getting back to your question, definitely the kinds of content that we see is really dependent on what the algorithm thinks about us. And then the thing that you mentioned about narcissism is essentially, of course, we enjoy. It's not necessarily pathological when we like looking good online, obviously. But the thing is that there's also not just looking good, but there's this fantasy that those online selves actually represent us, and it's not our personal fantasy. We know that it's different from our quote unquote real life, right? But then those are the images that are there to represent us, and those are the fantasies underlying the Silicon Valley ideology and all of these tech startups everywhere, is that we are fully our data. We are nothing more than what they can gather from us, and which is, the fantasy is that the more data you can gather, then the closer you get to the truth, right? And as philosophers, as critical
Right.
theorists, we need to really ask, what do you mean when you say that you are getting closer to the truth? And who gets to say that, and why do you say that it can be reduced to just data online, right? And there we get to all of these interesting dynamics between the kinds of perversion, which is like, I know that's not me, but and I know that people are mining my data, but nonetheless I do it anyway, because it's like, on the one hand, it's just it's what we're used to, it's how we socialize these days, but also on the other hand, it's pleasurable in a way, because we get the likes, we get the attention, we get the retweets, we get the follows. So there's this switch in our mind, which is like, because in the past, when we talk about the Lacanian big other, for example, like the kind of imaginary universe where we to whom that we present our ourselves, right, our true selves. Now
Right.
that's very real in social media, because people get to acknowledge us, people actually get to comment on our posts, people actually get to like our selfies, right? So there's that specific enjoyment in the midst of the worry in how our data is being used and how our privacy is being infringed upon, and all these things.
But there's a projection. So we as humans, as individuals, obviously want to project something into this digital landscape, a version of who we want to be or appear to be. And then there's also the projection of the folks who want to contain that. So if you're, it's one thing to be taking selfies and be a teenage girl and seeing other teenage girls and trying to. It's another thing if you're, wanting to engage in political discourse as an opinionated woman, and then what kind of projection are you going to get back to you from the folks who are there to control that discourse versus, so that's why I asked, like, what kind of experience does a 17-year-old woman girl have compared to a 17-year-old boy online, and what they're generally receiving?
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, personally, I can't really speak about the 17-year-old girls versus boys, but yeah, personally, it's just like me being trans online on Twitter. Obviously, that's just really, there are the kinds of people who do not take anything I say seriously just because I'm trans, and just because I post selfies, they think that my thoughts don't matter because like I'm shallow. Because I like posting selfies online, and then on the other, because there's also this section in our book. I'm jumping a bit all over the place here, but there's this section in our book analyzing selfies, which is basically "Father, can you see I'm selfie?" which is a play on the Freudian dream. Father, can you see I'm burning? What we want to say there is essentially posting selfies is it's a plea for recognition, right? It's also a we want others to recognize the vulnerability behind posting a selfie. That's especially true for trans people and for people of marginalized identities, right? But then again, based on my personal experience, obviously those invite chasers, trans chasers who get into my DMs with like unsolicited sexual messages, because they only see the surface and just assume that I am that kind of object, and just this quality to that object. Just, I'm jumping all over the place, but hopefully that kind of answers the.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is more from the consumer perspective, meaning like because they go into spirals, right? So if there's this Gamergate community and it becomes a community itself, or if young girls are only seeing like body image, which is great, and see, but also if they're not seeing political content, if they're not seeing other content out there, and men are only seeing, I'm using gender, being very gender specific because I feel like that's kind of how they're designing this. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, and I mean, we would kind of sort of look at that. We could look at that through, things like, the filter bubble or
Right.
the echo chamber and things like that, where of course networks by default are sort of built around kind of clustering things together. That's how kind of networks often function. That's certainly how social media functions. It clusters kind of groups together in the hope that kind of like-minded people or like-minded communities or groups will kind of form, because that's what people want to do. That's a very kind of human thing to maybe to wish for or to desire. It's kind of built, the internet or social media kind of built on this kind of friendship model, and on, I have friends based on, we have the same interests or whatever. That's how relationships form, and that is kind of reproduced on the internet. But then, as you say, whether that's always necessarily a good development in terms of having political debate, or kind of seeing other content, that's a very good question. On the other hand, of course, sort of what we also see, I mean, we've spoken about it just now, is then instances of harassment and abuse where echo chambers are actually deliberately kind of torn down, because you get people sort of invading each other's or kind of going into each other's sort of territory as
Right.
well.
Right.
So I think we kind of see both in a way, and of course that then makes kind of politics very messy or very difficult to kind of think about, or to think about ways of resisting that.
It's interesting because I think about, you started off by saying this all began around 2015 with Gamergate and Trump running for office, and so the internet is supposed to, the more data you'd think would be, the more you'd have more complicated and dynamic expressions of who an individual is, sort of on an individual basis, like a mosaic, rather than you that place, you that place. If you go there, you're going to get harassment and attacks and memes, and you better go back to where you're set up to be, because that's how the algorithm was built. To say it in a very raw way, I feel like that's kind of what we've come to. And if you want to venture into, if I as a 38-year-old woman wants to venture into YouTube political hosting, I better come up with some clever tactics to spill over into that pipeline and have some great allies. Otherwise, I'm not going to do well. And the reality is, it's very tough. You can't just like burst in, and there's a lot of harassment that comes with it simultaneously. If you're not deemed for that, but I guess like what I don't understand is this just a reflection of how the algorithms were built? Or is there sort of like, and maybe both, someone like a Steve Bannon or Cambridge Analytica, are those folks really speeding it up by, putting some extra juice in it to further their political goals?
Yeah, maybe it's both. So we also kind of need to think about that. Silicon Valley is also very, it may appear very liberal on the surface, but then it's, we know it's very, very kind of penetrated by, right-wing ideas and so on. So that's all, documented and stuff like that. So those two kind of factors are probably interrelated, and at the same time, of course, platforms would always describe themselves as sort of apolitical and so on. But then how platforms are built is that they value, particularly kind of emotional content, kind of content that's sort of designed to kind of arouse various feelings and responses, because presumably that will get engagement going, that will sort of get people fired up and commenting or whatever, because that then means that there are users there. If those
Right.
platforms don't have any users, they can shut down.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think there's this kind of belief or excuse that they like to make, which is like, this is just data, this is just business, this is just technology, like, and algorithms. Like, how we're not political, but I mean, obviously that is right. I mean, who structures these kinds of power relations, and who owns the data and stuff like that, and where does your capital come from, and how are you traded, and you know, as Jacob mentioned, the connections behind the ones who actually have the money in Silicon Valley and stuff like that. So some people, obviously, like Cambridge Analytica and stuff like that, they have an explicit political goal, and you know, gathering 5,000 data points and so on. But then there are cases like that. But even if there are not those kinds of explicit political goals, it's always already political by the very nature of how these data are mined and are structured, right? By who gets to design the algorithms, and for whom, and who gets access to these technologies, who gets to own the data and use them, and to what end. That's already a political question.
And at the same time, I mean, we don't want to appear, you know, too kind of sort of pessimistic or too kind of deterministic.
I think there's a moment to be so. I think it's understandable, this moment.
You know, that's partly why Gamergate happened, or why, you know, all this kind of horrible stuff is happening, is because, you know, the internet has become a lot more kind of diversified, and you know, things have changed, partly, you know, because of kind of those platforms, because of social media sort of, you know, is now so mainstream, you know, that has also enabled, you know, something like your show, you know, and stuff like that, and other voices, you know, being heard, and being able to support each other, and, you know, moments of solidarity, and so on. That's all possible as well, just to kind of, you know, to sort of highlight that, or emphasize that. Yeah.
But it's tough. It's not the old days anymore.
Yeah.
Anyways, really, really interesting conversation. Would love to have you guys back on. I feel like there's a lot of moments where we could, you know, move into the depths of your work.
Because we haven't even talked about sex yet. Yeah.
Yes, we haven't. So let's move on. See? All right. On the next interview, we'll dig into sex. But that's a great teaser. You know, you kind of I think it's a great reason for people to buy your book, because you haven't even talked about the sex part yet. And that's, you know, obviously what sells. Thank you so much for joining us. Event Horizon, Sexuality, Politics, Online Culture, and the Limits of Capitalism. Bonni Rambatan and Jacob Johanssen. Really, really appreciate you joining us today. And
Thank you.
good luck with the sales. It's been out for, you know, about 2 weeks. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
If you aren't already, join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show and become a patron. That's how we do this. It's really important to support independent media.